On a Saturday morning in March of 1983 at the Bremer County Equipment Liquidation Auction in Waverly, Iowa, Robert Williams raised his hand. 51 years old, farmer, quiet, the kind of man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. His hand went up. $8,700 for the entire remaining lot. 32 tractors and implements that no one in the room had wanted to buy individually. The auctioneer had been trying to sell them one at a time since 9 that morning. A rusted Farmall H with a seized engine. No takers. An Alice Chalmers WD-45 missing its rear tires. No takers. An Oliver 77 with a cracked manifold and a bird nest in the air cleaner housing. Someone offered $40 as a joke and withdrew it when nobody laughed. By 11:30, the auctioneer had moved 19 machines and sold exactly 3 of them for a combined total of $940. The remaining 32 sat in the back rows of the lot like a congregation no one had come to visit. Robert's hand went up. $8,700 for all of them, everything still sitting on the gravel. The room did what rooms do when a man says something that doesn't fit the arithmetic. It laughed. Not cruel, or not entirely cruel. It was the laughter of practical people who understood equipment values and scrap metal prices and the distance between the two. Watching a man offer real money for machines that most of them wouldn't have hauled home for free. Michael Johnson was sitting in the second row. Mike owned Johnson Farm and Implement on Route 218 just south of Waverly, the largest equipment dealership in Bremer County. He had been selling new tractors and combines to local farmers for 19 years, 47 years old, clean-shaven, white shirt tucked into pressed khakis and a pair of leather shoes that had never touched a plowed field. His hands were soft. His Ford pickup in the parking lot was brand new, a company truck with the Johnson logo on both doors in green and gold. He turned around in his metal folding chair and looked at Robert with the particular expression of a man who believes he is witnessing a mistake and wants to make sure everyone else sees it too, loud enough that the people in the rows behind him heard it clearly. Someone ought to ask him how many acres he needs to bury 32 piles of scrap iron. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Paul Dietrich, who had been calling farm sales in northeast Iowa for 26 years. He looked at Robert over the rim of his bifocals. "Mr. Williams, you're bidding $8,700 for the entire remaining lot. 32 units. That's the bid." Robert nodded once. "That's the bid." Paul waited. He scanned the room the way auctioneers scan rooms, looking for a twitch, a raised finger, a shift in posture that might signal a counter. Nobody moved. Nobody raised a card. The 32 machines sat on the gravel in 3 uneven rows, rust-colored and quiet. Their paint faded to the kind of dull red and orange and green that old equipment turns when it has been sitting outside for years without attention. Paul brought the gavel down. "Sold. 32 units to Robert Williams for $8,700. Nobody in that auction room understood what Robert Williams had just purchased, including if he was being honest with himself. Robert Williams. Because to understand what he'd done, you had to understand where he'd learned to do it. And that meant going back. To a workshop built in 1958. Thomas Williams. Robert's father. Born 1920. Farmed 180 acres of rolling ground east of Waverly that produced good corn in wet years and decent corn in dry ones, and just enough income to keep a family fed and a mortgage paid if the man running it was careful. Thomas had been careful in the way that a specific generation of Iowa farmers understood the word. Careful did not mean timid. Careful meant aware. Aware of what the land needed. Aware of what the equipment needed. Aware of what the bank wanted versus what the bank deserved to get. Thomas had farmed with a Farmall H he bought used in 1952 and a 2-bottom plow he rebuilt himself from parts he collected over 3 winters. He never bought a new machine in his life. Not because he couldn't afford to, though the margins were always thin, but because he believed that buying new equipment was a way of paying someone else for knowledge you should have acquired yourself. The shop behind the barn was Thomas's real investment. He had built it in 1958. A concrete floor building with a wood stove and a workbench that ran the full length of the east wall. Over 30 years he had filled it with tools, not expensive tools, not matched sets from a catalog, but the accumulation of a working life. Wrenches inherited from his own father, socket sets bought at farm sales for pennies on the dollar, a valve spring compressor he had fabricated from angle iron and a truck spring, a timing light he repaired twice rather than replace. Robert had learned to take apart a carburetor before he learned to drive. By the time he was 12, he could diagnose a misfire by sound alone. His father would start an engine, and Robert would stand beside it with his eyes closed, listening, and Thomas would ask him what he heard. Too rich. Valve lash off on number 3. Timing about 2 degrees advanced. It was a language Thomas taught the way other fathers taught their sons to fish or hunt. Patient repetition until the knowledge lived in the hands and the ears and not just the head. His father used to say something that Robert carried with him, the way other men carried pocket knives or photographs. Every broken machine is just a conversation you haven't finished yet. You listen long enough, it tells you what it needs. Thomas Williams died in the spring of 1976. Heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in the shop with a half-disassembled water pump on the bench and his reading glasses folded neatly beside it. 71 years old. He left Robert the farm, the shop, the tools, and no debt. 0. Not a dollar owed to any bank or any man in Bremer County in 1976. That was not common. By 1983 it was almost unheard of. Robert had taken over the 180 acres and farmed them the way his father had farmed them. Tight rotation. Corn, soybeans, oats. Maintained his own equipment past the point where other farmers would have traded up. Kept the shop stocked and the tools sharp and the knowledge current. He was not a social man. He did not hold court at the coffee shop or volunteer opinions at the co-op. He was the kind of farmer who showed up at planting, showed up at harvest, fixed what broke between seasons, and otherwise kept to himself, quiet, patient, watchful. His wife Linda had married him in 1961 and had learned early that Robert expressed himself through action rather than language. When Robert came home from the auction that Saturday afternoon and told her he had spent $8,700 on 32 broken machines, Linda did not raise her voice. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around her coffee cup. "That's the combine fund, Robert. All of it." Robert stood in the doorway with his cap in his hands. "I know what it is. Every dollar we set aside since 1979. I know." Linda looked at him for a long moment. She had been married to this man for 22 years. She had seen him make decisions that looked foolish to everyone except the two of them. And she had seen most of those decisions prove sound over time. But $8,700 was not a small number on a 180-acre farm in the spring of 1983. It was not a small number anywhere in Iowa in the spring of 1983. She did not say anything else. She opened the ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer, the one where she recorded every farm expense and every farm payment in her careful handwriting. And she wrote, March 12, 1983, Bremer County Auction, 32 units equipment, $8,700. Then she closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer and looked out the window at the March sky, which was the color of old pewter and promised nothing. Because what was happening in American agriculture in the spring of 1983 made Robert's purchase look like the act of a man who had lost his mind. The American farm crisis had been building since 1980, and by the spring of '83 it was beginning to destroy the rural Midwest in ways that would take a generation to fully measure. In the 1970s, commodity prices had boomed. Export markets expanded. Corn hit $3.50 a bushel. Iowa farmland climbed from $419 an acre in 1970 to over $2,100 an acre by 1981. Banks encouraged farmers to borrow against rising land values to finance expansion. Buy more land, buy bigger equipment, grow the operation. The math seemed sound because the math assumed commodity prices would hold and land values would keep rising. Neither assumption survived contact with 1980. Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve raised the prime interest rate to 21.5% to break inflation. Farm operating loans that had been manageable at 8% became suffocating at 18% overnight. Foreign demand collapsed. Corn dropped below $2.50. Land values that had been climbing for a decade reversed and began a fall that would not stop until Iowa farmland had lost 63% of its peak value. The Farm Credit System, the backbone of agricultural lending, reported losses of $2.7 billion. Over 300,000 American farms would be lost before the crisis ran its course. In Bremer County, the damage was visible from any fence line. The Henderson Place, 240 acres, 3 generations, foreclosed in January. The Platt brothers, who had farmed side by side since the early 1960s, sold their equipment at auction in February and moved to Cedar Rapids to look for factory work. The county auction yard was running foreclosure sales every 2 weeks, and the buyers at those sales were increasingly not farmers at all. They were representatives from land aggregation companies based in Des Moines and Kansas City and Omaha. Men in clean shoes who arrived with financing already arranged and bought distressed farmland the way other people bought stocks, quietly, strategically, and without any particular interest in what the land meant to the people who had worked it. Equipment dealers like Mike Johnson were caught in their own version of the trap. Through the 1970s, Johnson Farm and Implement had written millions in equipment loans. New John Deere 4440s at $32,000. New combines at $68,000, financed at rates that seemed reasonable when corn was $350 and seemed lethal when corn was $230. Now Mike's customers were defaulting on those loans, surrendering the equipment, and leaving Mike's lot crowded with repossessed machines he could not resell because nobody had the money or the credit to buy them. Mike Johnson did not yet know it, but the same force that was destroying his customers was going to destroy his dealership. That was 3 years away. In March of 1983, Mike was still confident enough to laugh at a man who bought 32 broken tractors. The conversation that happened at the Waverly Cafe the following Monday morning was the first time Mike Johnson said something directly to Robert Williams's face, and it set the terms for everything that came after. Robert had stopped at the cafe for coffee on his way to the co-op. Mike was sitting at the counter with 2 other men. One of them a loan officer from the Farmers and Merchants Bank, the other a feed salesman who covered the county. Robert sat down 2 stools away and ordered black coffee. Mike turned to face him and spoke in the tone of voice that men use when they believe they are offering wisdom to someone who has made a serious mistake. "Robert, I'm going to say this as a friend, and I mean it sincerely." Robert looked at his coffee, didn't look at Mike. "Those machines you bought Saturday are scrap metal with paint on them. You couldn't give them away at a yard sale in any county in Iowa. I've been selling real equipment for 19 years. And I can tell you that those Farmalls and Olivers and Alice Chalmers haven't been worth fixing since 1970. Parts are getting impossible to find. Labor to rebuild them costs more than the machine is worth when you're done. You just spent your seed money on the most expensive pile of rust in Bremer County." Robert drank his coffee. He did not look at Mike. He did not argue with any specific point Mike had made. "I appreciate the concern, Mike." That was all he said. He finished his coffee, paid, and left. And Mike watched him go through the cafe window and shook his head slowly. He said to the 2 men beside him, loud enough that the waitress heard it from the kitchen, "Give it 6 months. Those tractors will be sitting in the weeds behind his barn, and Robert Williams will be standing at my counter asking about financing a real machine. I've seen it 100 times." The loan officer nodded. The feed salesman nodded. Everyone in the cafe who had heard the conversation nodded or looked away or stirred their coffee, because Mike Johnson's version of reality was the version that made sense in Bremer County in 1983. You did not fix old machines. You did not go backward. You financed new equipment. You expanded your operation. You grew or you disappeared. That was the operating wisdom of American agriculture. And it had been the operating wisdom for 20 years. And by 1983 it was killing farmers at a rate of 3 times the national suicide average. But it was still the wisdom, because the people who sold the wisdom were still the people with the loudest voices in the room. Robert did not have a loud voice. Robert had a shop full of his father's tools and 32 machines that needed someone to listen to them. It took 4 days to haul them home. Robert borrowed a flatbed trailer from a neighbor and made 17 trips between the auction lot and his farm, 2 machines per load. Driving slow because the trailer's springs were old and the loads were heavy, and the March roads in Bremer County were soft with thaw. By Thursday evening, all 32 units were lined up in 3 rows behind the shop, and the view from the kitchen window looked like an equipment graveyard that had been organized by someone with a sense of order but no sense of restraint. Linda stood at that window for a long time Thursday evening. She did not say anything. She dried her hands on the dish towel and looked at the 3 rows of rusted metal extending out behind the building her father-in-law had built 25 years earlier. Robert was still outside, walking between the rows with a flashlight, touching each machine the way a man touches something he is planning to know intimately. David Williams, 23 years old, Robert's son, had helped his father haul every one of those 32 machines, driving the truck, backing the trailer, strapping the loads, not saying much, but present, and believing in ways he didn't yet understand that his father knew something the rest of the county didn't. Robert began on a Sunday evening in late March after chores were finished and the 180 acres were settled for the night. The shop was cold. He lit the wood stove his father had installed in 1962 and waited 20 minutes for the cast iron to heat the air enough that his hands would work without stiffening. Then he pulled the Farmall M inside using a chain and the hydraulic loader on his working tractor, positioned it under the single overhead light, and stood beside it for a long time without touching anything. The engine was seized. 4 pistons locked in 4 cylinders by 3 years of moisture and neglect, and the slow chemical patience of rust converting machine steel back into raw oxide. Robert knew that unseizing a Farmall M engine was not complicated. It was slow. There was a difference between those 2 things, and the difference was where most people gave up. He pulled the head first, 16 bolts, each one requiring penetrating oil in a breaker bar and the particular kind of steady pressure that breaks a corroded fastener free without snapping it. 3 of the 16 bolts broke anyway. He drilled them out using his father's drill press, extracted the broken shanks with an easy out, and retapped the holes. That was the first evening. 4 hours for 16 bolts. A man in a hurry would have looked at that rate of progress and calculated that the entire rebuild would take the rest of his natural life. Robert was not in a hurry. With the head off, he could see the cylinders. The bores were rust-locked, a thin orange crust bonding piston to wall along the full circumference of each cylinder. He filled each bore with a mixture of diesel fuel and automatic transmission fluid, a penetrating solution his father had used for decades, and left them to soak. 3 days. Every morning before chores, he checked the fluid level and topped it off. Every evening after chores, he tapped the tops of the pistons gently with a brass drift and a hammer, not trying to move them, just asking if they were ready. On the 3rd evening, piston number 2 moved. Not much, a 1/16 of an inch, but it moved. By the 5th evening, all 4 pistons were free. He pulled them, cleaned them, honed the cylinder walls with a ball hone mounted in his father's 1/2-inch drill, working each bore until the crosshatch pattern was even, and the rust was gone, and the surface felt like glass under his fingertip. New piston rings ordered from a parts supplier in Waterloo cost $34. A new head gasket set cost $28. The rod bearings were worn beyond specification, and a set of new bearings cost $12. The magneto, which provides spark on a Farmall M in place of a distributor, needed new points and a condenser, plus a rewinding of the primary coil. Robert did the rewinding himself, using a technique Kenneth Anderson would show him on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks from now. And the parts cost $45. New radiator hoses and a thermostat. 18. A rebuilt carburetor kit. 14. While he was working on the carburetor, pulling it apart on the bench under the overhead light, he opened the top drawer of his father's workbench looking for a gasket scraper. Inside, beneath a tray of assorted bolts, he found a small notebook. The cover was oil-stained, and the pages were yellowed, and the handwriting inside was his father's. Cramped, imprecise. It was a repair log. Dates, machines, Problems, solutions, costs, entries going back to 1959. Robert turned the pages slowly. He found entries for the family farm all H, entries for neighbors' machines Thomas had fixed as favors, entries for equipment that had passed through the shop over 20 years, and on a page near the back in slightly larger letters than the rest, as though Thomas had wanted to make sure the words stood out, a single sentence that was not a repair note at all. Don't count what you've spent. Count what you saved someone else from spending. Robert closed the notebook and set it on the bench beside the disassembled carburetor. He looked at it for a while. Then he finished the carburetor, installed it on the rebuilt engine, filled the cooling system, checked the oil, primed the fuel line, and turned the key. The Farmall M started on the third crank. The exhaust coughed twice, cleared, and settled into the deep, rhythmic idle that flathead four-cylinder engines have been making since 1939. Robert stood beside it with his hand on the hood and felt the vibration travel through the steel and into his palm and up his arm. And for a moment, standing in his father's shop with his father's tools on the bench and his father's words in a notebook 6 inches from his elbow, the distance between 1983 and 1959 was not very far at all. Total parts cost for the first Farmall M rebuild, $119. The machine had taken Robert 22 working evenings across 6 weeks. He had not counted the labor. A man does not count the hours he spends in his father's shop any more than he counts the hours he spends breathing. 1 week after the rebuild, a brown pickup truck that Robert did not recognize pulled into his driveway and parked beside the shop. The driver was an old man, thin, white-haired, wearing a canvas jacket that had been patched at both elbows and a John Deere cap so faded that the logo was more memory than print. His name was Kenneth Anderson, 78 years old. He had been the mechanic that half the farmers in Bremer County had called when their equipment broke from 1938 until his retirement in 1974. He had not been at the auction, but he had heard about Robert's purchase from 3 different people in 2 days, and he had driven out to see for himself. Robert found him standing in the first row of machines, both hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the Farmall M with an expression that Robert recognized, because it was the same expression his father used to wear when looking at an engine he hadn't worked on yet. Curiosity, assessment, respect. Your dad would have done the same thing. Kenneth said it without turning around. Robert said nothing. He stood beside the old man and waited. Kenneth walked the rows slowly. He stopped at each machine. He reached out and tapped the engine block on one of the Farmall M's with his knuckle, the way a doctor taps a chest, listening for the quality of the sound. He crouched beside an Oliver 88 and inspected the governor linkage. He ran his hand along the rail of an Alice Chalmers WD-45 and nodded at something only he understood. It took him 40 minutes to walk all 3 rows. When he was done, he came back to where Robert was standing and looked at him directly. Most folks see rust, Robert. You and I, we see what's underneath. These Farmalls were built to run 50 years. Most of them are only halfway through. He pulled a small notepad from his jacket and began flipping pages. He had been making notes as he walked. 9 of these machines, I can tell you right now, are 6 months and a few hundred from running. The Ms. Both of them. 2 of the Alice units. And that Oliver 88 with the good block. The rest will take longer. Some of them might not come back at all. But 9 of them. 9 good machines. That's what you've got to start with. Robert looked at the notepad. He looked at the rows. He thought about $8,700 in Linda's ledger and the combine fund that no longer existed, and the fact that 9 machines out of 32 was a better ratio than he had calculated on his own. Will you help me? Kenneth put the notepad back in his jacket. Didn't drive out here to look at the scenery. Late in March of 1983, a pickup truck older than Robert's pulled into the yard and stopped near the first row of machines. The driver was young, 24 years old, thin in the way that young men are thin when they are working hard and eating carefully. His name was Christopher Martinez. He had just signed a lease on 120 acres of ground 3 miles north of Waverly, and he was trying to figure out how to farm it with no equipment and no credit and no collateral that any bank in Bremer County would accept. Christopher had heard about Robert's 32 tractors. He stood at the edge of the rows and looked at them the way a thirsty man looks at a well he is not sure is functional. Mr. Williams. Robert was under the hood of the first Farmall M Hands black with oil, his father's socket set arranged on a shop rag beside the fender. He straightened up and looked at the young man for a long moment. What could you possibly do with 32 old tractors? Robert did not answer right away. He set the wrench down, wiped his hands on the rag, and looked at Christopher Martinez standing there with hope and doubt fighting for space on his face. Fix them. Sell them to people like you. Christopher didn't say anything. He looked at the Farmall with its hood up and its engine half disassembled. And he looked at Robert with grease on his forearms and certainty in his eyes. And something passed between them that neither man would have known how to describe, but both of them understood. A new John Deere 4440 on Mike Johnson's lot cost $32,000. Financed at 14.5% over 5 years, a farmer would pay $44,600 for that machine by the time the last payment cleared. That was the cost of a new tractor in Bremer County in the spring of 1983. Robert's entire lot of 32 machines had cost $8,700 total. And what Robert was about to prove over the next 14 years was that the distance between $44,600 and $8,700 was not a measure of equipment quality. It was a measure of how much debt a man was willing to carry and how much freedom he was willing to give up in exchange for a paint job and a warranty. Christopher looked at the rows of rusted machines one more time. Can I come back when you're ready?" The young man nodded, got in his truck, and drove back down the county road toward 120 acres and a future that depended entirely on whether Robert Williams knew what he was doing. Christopher Martinez came back on a Saturday in May. The Farmall M was finished, red paint fresh, not the original color but the right color, the deep oxide red that International Harvester had been using since before the war, engine warm, hydraulics tested, every system checked and rechecked. Christopher walked around it slowly. He touched the fender. He looked at the tires. Original. Worn, but sound. Enough tread for field work. How much? $1,100. Christopher pulled an envelope from his jacket, hands shaking just slightly, just enough that Robert noticed. "That's everything I have." Robert took the envelope. He did not count it in front of Christopher. He extended his hand and Christopher shook it. And the handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time, which is to say, it lasted long enough for both men to understand that what was being exchanged was not just a tractor. Robert showed him the throttle, the choke, the PTO lever, the hydraulic controls. Christopher listened the way Robert had once listened to his father, with his whole body, absorbing the information through his hands and his posture and the angle of his attention. Robert started the engine and let Christopher feel it idle. Then Christopher put the Farmall in road gear and drove it out of the yard and down the county road toward his 120 leased acres. And the sound of that engine faded slowly until the only thing left was the quiet of a spring afternoon in Iowa and the knowledge that an $1,100 tractor was about to do the work that Mike Johnson said required a $32,000 investment. Linda was watching from the kitchen window. When Robert came inside, she opened the ledger and handed him the pen. Robert wrote in the careful block letters he had learned in a one-room schoolhouse 40 years earlier. May 14, 1983. Farmall M Serial 157832, sold to Christopher Martinez. $1,100. Linda looked at the entry, and then she looked at the column of expenses she had been tracking since March. Parts for the first rebuild, $119. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The arithmetic was saying it for her. Robert rebuilt 4 machines that first year. The Farmall M he sold to Christopher, a second Farmall M that he sold to a young couple in Chickasaw County for $1,200. They were farming 80 acres. They had applied for equipment loans at 3 different banks. All 3 had turned them down. One of the IH Super Cs. a compact and nimble machine that went to a retired teacher outside Plainfield who wanted a tractor for his 40-acre hobby farm. $750. Parts cost $92. And one of the Ford 8Ns which Robert restored for $87 in parts and sold for $650 to a woman who ran a vegetable operation south of Tripoli. Total revenue from year 1, $3,700. Total parts cost, $412. 28 machines remaining. But the numbers were not the point, or not the only point, because every one of those 4 sales had done something that Robert was only beginning to understand the value of. They had kept 4 operations alive that would have died without them. The young couple in Chickasaw County would have lost their lease by fall. The retired teacher would have sold his land to a neighbor who was consolidating. The vegetable farmer would have gone back to working someone else's operation instead of her own. And Christopher Martinez. Christopher Martinez would have walked away from farming entirely and taken a job at the implement plant in Cedar Falls making parts for machines he could not afford to own. Except the year after that was harder. 1984 brought the worst drought Bremer County had seen since 1977. Corn made 68 bushels per acre on Robert's 180 acres against a 10-year average of 131. Net farm income dropped to barely enough to cover property taxes and seed for the following spring. Robert and Linda ate carefully that winter. They did not eat poorly, because Linda kept a garden and a chest freezer that had been full since August. But they ate with the awareness that every meal was a calculation. Robert rebuilt 5 machines in 1984. Working through the drought evenings when there was nothing to do in the fields because the fields had nothing to give. Both Farmall 80s were completed. 2 of the Alice Chalmers WD-45s, which Kenneth Anderson helped him with on Saturday afternoons, and the second Ford 9N. He sold 4 of them. The buyers were all the same kind of person, young, starting out, underfunded, unable to qualify for equipment loans at any rate from any bank. One of them was a 28-year-old named Brandon Walker, who had taken over his father's foreclosed 200 acres by negotiating a lease from the bank that now held the title. Brandon paid Robert $1,300 for an Alice Chalmers WD-45 and drove it home the same day. He told Robert it was the first piece of equipment he had owned outright since the foreclosure. His eyes were wet when he said it. Total revenue from year 2, $4,600. Total parts cost, $527. 23 machines remaining. The drought broke in late August with a 3-day rain that turned the county roads to mud and filled the Wapsie-Pinnacon River to the top of its banks. Robert stood in the shop door and watched the rain come down on the rows of remaining machines. And he thought about his father. Thomas had farmed through the drought of 1956, the worst in his lifetime, and had come out the other side with the same land and the same equipment and the same zero balance at the bank. Robert was doing the same arithmetic his father had done. Different numbers, same principle. Because while Robert was rebuilding tractors in his father's shop, Mike Johnson was discovering that the forces destroying his customers were not going to spare him either. Through 1984 and into 85, Mike's dealership was bleeding. Repossessed machines crowded his lot. Machines he could not sell because the people who would have bought them 2 years earlier were the same people who had defaulted on them 6 months ago. Floor plan financing was killing him. The interest alone on unsold inventory was running $4,000 a month, and the bank that held his line of credit was no longer returning his calls with the same enthusiasm they had shown in 1979. Mike's customers were defaulting at a rate that he had not believed possible. Spring of 1985, 12 foreclosures among the farmers who had financed equipment through Johnson Farm and Implement. 12 families, 12 operations, gone. And every one of them was a reminder that Mike had sold them the debt that killed them. He started driving past Robert's farm, not deliberately, or maybe deliberately, but without admitting it to himself. April of 1985. He drove past on his way back from a service call in Denver, and he saw Robert's rows getting shorter, machines disappearing one at a time, and strange trucks in the yard. Buyers. July of that same year. He drove past again, slowed down, stopped on the shoulder for a full minute, watched Robert working on an Oliver in the yard. Mike did not go in. He drove away. And at night in his office above the showroom he sat alone with the ledgers open and tried to find a version of the math that did not end with him losing everything. There was no such version. His mother spoke to him one evening in September. Patricia Johnson, 71 years old, a widow, living with Mike since his father had died in '78. "Do you remember 1956? Mike looked up from the papers spread across the kitchen table. "Remember what?" "Thomas Williams fixed your father's tractor. Free. We were broke." Mike did not say anything. "Robert Williams is Thomas's son." Patricia left the room, but the seed was planted, and seeds have a way of growing even in soil that does not want them. Year 3 of the crisis, 1985. The farm crisis hit bottom. The Federal Land Bank of Omaha failed. Across Iowa, farm foreclosure auctions were running weekly in some counties. In Bremer County, 3 more families Robert had known his entire life lost their land. The Muller family, the Carpenter family, the Voyle brothers whose grandfather had broken the original sod on their section in 1891. All gone. Robert rebuilt 6 machines in 1985, more than any previous year. The demand was the reason. Farmers who could not afford new equipment and could not get credit for used equipment from dealers were hearing about the man east of Waverly who sold rebuilt tractors for prices that did not require a loan. Robert sold all 6. Total revenue, $6,200. Parts cost, $783. 17 machines remaining. Something else happened in 1985 that Robert did not learn about until later. Christopher Martinez, farming his 120 leased acres with the Farmall M he had bought from Robert 2 years earlier, made his lease payment in full and on time. His landlord, a banker in Waterloo who had been preparing to sell the parcel to an aggregation company, renewed the lease for another 3 years at the same rate. Christopher was the only young farmer in Bremer County that year who was current on every obligation. The Farmall M had not missed a day of work since Christopher drove it home in May of 1983. Somewhere during year 3, on an evening when Robert was working on the 15th machine, an Oliver 88 with a crankshaft bearing that needed replacing. He sat down on the shop stool and looked at his hands. They were cracked along every knuckle. His shoulders ached from working overhead. His back had developed a persistent tightness along the left side that did not fully release even after a hot shower. He was 53 years old, and he had been rebuilding machines every evening for 2.5 years after full days of farming 180 acres. And the weariness was not temporary. It had settled into him the way coal dust settles into an old building, slowly, and with no intention of leaving. He remembered something his father had said once on a winter evening, very much like this one when Thomas had been working on a hay baler that had been giving trouble for 3 seasons and could easily have been junked and replaced. Robert had asked him why he kept fixing it. Thomas had looked up from the bench with grease on his forehead. "The hardest part of fixing anything isn't the work. It's deciding the work is worth finishing." Robert looked at the Oliver 88. He looked at the row of machines still waiting outside the shop door. Dark shapes against the November sky. 17 conversations he hadn't finished yet. He picked up the wrench and went back to work. Linda found him in the shop at 11 that night. She did not say, "Come to bed." She did not say, "You're working too hard." She set a cup of coffee on the workbench beside his father's repair notebook and put her hand on his shoulder and stood there for a moment without speaking. Then she went back to the house. The coffee was still warm when Robert drank it 20 minutes later, except that not everything Robert touched came back to life. November of 1985. Robert chose the Oliver 88 from the remaining row. It had a reputation. Enthusiasts considered it one of the finest tractors ever manufactured. Smooth-running 6-cylinder, solid engineering. A customer had already put a deposit down. Ryan Robinson, 22 years old. His mother had lost their 160 acres in '84. Ryan was renting 80 acres of ground and needed a machine he could afford without borrowing. $200 deposit. Deadline Christmas. The first 2 weeks went like every other rebuild. Unseize the engine. Success. New rings and bearings. Success. Magneto rebuild. Success. Week 3. Robert was doing final assembly. Fill the cooling system. Check for leaks. Water came out. Not from a hose, not from a gasket, from inside the block itself. A crack in the cylinder wall. Internal. Invisible during disassembly. The kind of failure that only reveals itself when you think you're done. Kenneth came out to look at it. The old man knelt beside the engine for 20 minutes. Inspecting. Tapping. Running his fingers along seams Robert couldn't see. Crack this deep. This placement. Can't weld it, Robert. Have to try. Robert tried. 3 times he welded that crack. 3 times it opened again when the block heated and cooled. JB weld. Failed. Attempt to sleeve the cylinder. The sleeve would not fit correctly. Tolerance was wrong. 3 weeks wasted. $400 in parts. Failure. Friday night, December 13th, 1985, 10 o'clock. Robert sat alone in the shop. The Oliver 88 still would not run. Christmas was 12 days away. Ryan Robinson needed that machine for spring planting. Robert had taken the man's deposit and made a promise. And for the first time since he had raised his hand at the auction, for the first time since he had written that check for $8,700, for the first time since he had started this entire mad project. Robert stopped. He did not cry. He just sat on the stool with his hands covering his face and his shoulders carrying a weight that had finally become too much. David found him like that. His son had come out to the shop for reasons he could not have explained if asked, just a feeling that his father might need company. David did not say anything. He sat down on the floor beside the stool, put his hand on his father's shoulder, and waited. 20 minutes passed. Finally, David spoke. "You want to quit?" Robert's voice came out rough. "Tired. You think I should?" "No, but I'll support you if you need to." Robert lifted his head, looked at the Oliver that had beaten him. 28 cheek. "I've brought back 15, 13 left. The Oliver. Scrap. I was wrong." Saturday morning, Robert called Ryan Robinson. The conversation was short. "I can't fix the Oliver. I'm returning your deposit, plus $100 for making you wait." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "You have another one?" "I do. Ford 9N. $600. I'll take it." Robert stripped the Oliver 88 for parts. Everything that was still good went into the spare parts inventory for other rebuilds. The block went to the scrapyard for $40. Net loss on the Oliver, $360. But his reputation stayed intact, because Robert had been honest about his failure. And in Bremer County, in 1985, when half the people you did business with were lying about their financial situations just to survive another month, honesty was worth more than success. Year 4, 1986. Robert rebuilt 5 more machines, all 5 successfully, 12 remaining. His customers now included farmers from 3 adjacent counties. Word had spread the way word spreads in agricultural communities, through feed stores and sale barns and the quiet networks of people who need things they cannot afford and are looking for someone who understands that need. Man near Waverly. Good cheap tractors. Honest. Mike Johnson's comments at the Waverly Cafe were changing. Not in the direction of respect. Not yet. But in the direction of something less certain. He's still out there playing mechanic, fixing machines that were obsolete before the moon landing. Those people are going to regret it when those old engines throw a rod or burn a valve and there's nobody within 100 miles who stocks the parts. But fewer people at the counter were nodding along. Some of them knew Christopher Martinez. Some of them knew Brandon Walker. Some of them had driven past Robert's farm and seen the rows getting shorter one machine at a time, and they had begun to perform a calculation that Mike Johnson had not yet allowed himself to perform. The calculation was simple. Robert's customers were still farming. Mike's customers were losing their land. In August of 1986, the Johnson Farm and Implement sign on Route 218, which had been lit every evening since 1964, went dark for the first time. The reason was not dramatic. Mike had not made a major equipment sale in 4 months. His lot was crowded with repossessed machines he could not move. The bank that held his floor plan financing had called a meeting. The meeting did not go well. On a Friday afternoon in October, the same month that the leaves along the Wapsi-Pinnacon River turned the color of old copper, and the corn in the fields stood dry and pale and ready for harvest. Mike Johnson closed Johnson Farm and Implement permanently. 22 years of business ended with a sign on the door and a legal notice in the Waverly Democrat. The closing auction was scheduled for the morning of Friday, October 17th. Friday morning, October 17th, 1986. The weather cooperated with the gravity of the occasion. October in northeast Iowa brings mornings that start cold and damp, with fog sitting in the low spots along the river bottoms and the sun taking its time burning through. Mike's lot on Route 218 was laid out in rows the same way every equipment dealer arranges inventory, with the newest and most expensive machines facing the road and the older stock pushed toward the back. On that Friday morning, the rows held 14 unsold tractors, brand new, factory paint, dealer prep completed, price stickers still affixed to the windshields. A John Deere 4450, $38,000. A 4650, $52,000. Two 2450s at $29,000 each. A Case IH 594, $41,000. Machines built to work the most productive farmland on earth. Machines engineered with the latest hydraulics and electronics and ergonomic cabs, sitting in neat rows behind a building that would be a farm supply store by Christmas, and a storage facility by the following spring, and an empty building with weeds growing through the parking lot cracks by 1989. The auction drew a crowd, not the buying crowd that Mike would have wanted, the watching crowd, farmers who had done business with Mike for years, mechanics who had worked on machines Mike had sold, neighbors, people from town who had watched the green and gold sign on Route 218 the way small-town people watch landmarks, as fixed points in a landscape that is supposed to stay the same. Mike Johnson was there. He had no legal obligation to attend the liquidation of his own business, but he came anyway. Because Mike Johnson was the kind of man who watched things through to the end, even when the end was not the one he had planned. He stood at the far edge of the lot near the service bay doors, with his hands in the pockets of a jacket that was newer than anything Robert Williams owned. His face was composed. His posture was straight. He looked like a man who had decided in advance how he was going to carry this day, and was executing that decision with the same discipline he had brought to 22 years of selling farm equipment. The auctioneer was setting up the PA system at the front of the lot. Bidders were registering at a folding table. The 14 new tractors sat in their rows, silent and gleaming and perfectly useless to a county that could not afford them. And then the sound came from the county road. It came before the machine was visible. A deep rhythmic chuffing, the unmistakable exhaust note of a flathead four-cylinder engine turning over at low RPM. Not the smooth purr of a modern diesel, not the turbocharged whisper of a machine designed to be quiet. This was an older sound, a mechanical sound, the sound of fuel and air and spark and cast iron doing what they had been designed to do 40 years earlier, and doing it without apology. It was a sound that most men in that parking lot had not heard in 20 years, and several of them turned toward the road before they understood why they were turning, the way a person turns toward a familiar voice in a crowded room. Then the gravel trembled, not the smooth hum of rubber tires on hardpack. A heavier pulse, a slower rhythm, the weight of steel pressing into packed ground with each rotation, the kind of vibration you feel in your boots before you hear it with your ears. Then the Farmall M crested the small rise at the entrance to Mike's lot. Red paint. Not the original color, but the right color. The deep oxide red that International Harvester had used on every Farmall since 1939. Chrome exhaust stack catching the thin October sun. Front tires tracking true. Engine idling with the steady confidence of a machine that has been rebuilt by someone who listened to it. Robert Williams at the wheel, sitting straight, wearing the same canvas jacket he wore every day, not hurrying. Behind the Farmall on a flatbed trailer pulled by Robert's farm truck, driven by David Williams, sat two more machines, an Alice Chalmers WD-45 in factory orange, rebuilt and running, and a Ford 8N in gray and red, compact and clean, 3 machines from the lot of 32 that Robert had bought for $8,700 at the Bremer County auction 3.5 years ago. Robert was not there to bid on anything. He was not there to watch Mike Johnson's liquidation sale. He was there to make 3 deliveries. Christopher Martinez was waiting at the edge of the lot. He had driven in from his 120 acres and was standing beside his truck with his arms crossed, watching the Farmall M approach with an expression that combined recognition and something close to reverence. Beside him stood Brandon Walker, 30 years old now, still farming the 200 acres he had leased back from the bank after his father's foreclosure. And next to Brandon, a younger man named Ryan Robinson, 22, whose widowed mother had lost the family's 160 acres in '84, and whose only path back into farming was 80 acres of rented ground and a machine he could afford without borrowing. Robert pulled the Farmall M onto the lot and brought it to a stop. The engine idled. The exhaust note settled into the morning air. David backed the trailer in and unloaded the Alice Chalmers and the Ford. 3 rebuilt machines, 3 young farmers, the entire transaction conducted in a parking lot full of new tractors that no one could afford to buy. Robert climbed down from the Farmall. He handed the keys to Ryan Robinson. David handed the keys to the Alice Chalmers to Brandon Walker. The Ford was already paid for and registered to a young farmer from Butler County who was driving up that afternoon to collect it. Robert shook each man's hand. He did not make a speech. He did not look at the 14 new John Deeres and Case YHs lined up 20 yards away. He did not need to look at them. The comparison was making itself in the mind of every person watching. 14 brand new tractors. Total sticker value over $400,000. Unsold. Unsellable. The dealer who had staked his life on them was standing 30 feet away watching his business end. 3 rebuilt tractors. Total original purchase price for all 32 machines, $8,700. Total parts cost for these 3 rebuilds combined, less than $400, sold to young farmers at prices that left them debt-free, heading to fields that would be worked by the end of the week. For a long moment the parking lot was quiet, not the laughing quiet of 3.5 years earlier at the Bremer County auction, not the polite quiet of a crowd waiting for the auctioneer to begin. A different quiet. The quiet of men watching something they did not have a word for yet. Something that rearranged the order of what was valuable and what was worthless. Something that suggested the entire framework they had been using to make decisions for the last 20 years might have been built on the wrong foundation. Christopher Martinez started the Farmall M. The engine caught on the first crank. The exhaust pulsed. Brandon Walker started the Alice Chalmers. The 2 engines idled side by side in the October air, their rhythms slightly different, one a 4-cylinder and one a 4-cylinder of a different bore and stroke, but both alive, both turning over with the unhurried confidence of machines that had been listened to by someone who understood what they were saying. Mike Johnson stood at the edge of his own closing auction and watched Robert Williams' rebuilt machines idle past the row of unsold John Deeres. He did not speak. His arms hung at his sides, his jaw was set, but his eyes were doing something his jaw was trying to prevent. The people closest to him could see it. A softening around the edges, a focusing on the middle distance. The expression of a man performing arithmetic he should have done years earlier and arriving at an answer he did not want to accept. The 3 young farmers drove their tractors off the lot. Christopher turned right toward his 120 acres. Brandon turned left toward the rented ground that had once belonged to his father. Ryan Robinson followed the county road north toward 80 acres and a second chance. The sound of their engines faded down the blacktop one by one, until the only sounds left on Mike's lot were the auctioneer testing his microphone and the October wind moving through the bare branches. And the particular emptiness that fills a building when the purpose it was built for has moved on without it. Robert climbed into his truck. David was already in the passenger seat. Neither of them looked back as they pulled out of the lot. The Johnson Farm and Implement sign went dark that Friday evening. It had been lit continuously since 1964. The building passed through 3 owners in the next 4 years. The green and gold lettering faded. The parking lot cracked. The service bay where Mike had maintained the equipment he sold collected dust and sparrow nests. In the particular emptiness that fills a building when the purpose it was built for has moved on without it. But the conversation between Robert Williams and Mike Johnson that everyone in Bremer County still remembers did not happen that day. It happened 5 years later, on a bench outside the Waverly feed store. And when it happened, it changed the way both men understood what they had spent their lives doing. Mike Johnson took a job in November of 1986, managing a small engine repair shop in Cedar Falls. Not selling, repairing. The irony was not lost on anyone. Certainly not on Mike himself, who spent the first 3 months of that job learning to do with his hands what he had spent 22 years paying other people to do for him. His hands developed calluses for the first time at age 50. Robert continued. Years 1987 and 88 brought 4 more rebuilds, sold to farmers who heard about the man east of Waverly through the same quiet networks that had always existed in agricultural communities but which had become lifelines now. By the end of 1988, the accounting was complete. 23 machines sold, 1 kept. The original Farmall M that Robert drove every working day. 4 held as loaners for customers whose equipment needed service during planting or harvest. 4 scrapped or parted out when the damage proved too deep. 28 of 32 successfully returned to service. Total parts cost across 8 years, $14,200. Linda's ledger recorded every purchase, every gasket set, every bearing, every quart of paint, every length of radiator hose, in the same careful handwriting she had used on the first entry in March of '83. The ledger was a small hardcover notebook with a green cloth cover, and it lived in the kitchen drawer beside the silverware. And by 1991 it contained 247 entries spanning 94 pages, $8,700 for the machines, $14,200 in parts, total investment, $22,900 across 8 years, 23 families still on their land. Those numbers would have meant nothing to Robert if he had been the only one who knew them, but by 1991 Bremer County had done its own arithmetic, and the results were becoming difficult to ignore. Of the approximately 60 farmers in Bremer County who had financed new equipment through Johnson Farm and Implement during the boom years of the late 70s and early 80s, 11 were still farming in 1991, 11 out of 60. The other 49 had lost their land to foreclosure, or sold under duress, or simply walked away from operations that the debt had made impossible to sustain. Their acreage had been absorbed by consolidation companies, or purchased at distressed prices by neighbors who had managed to stay solvent, and the net effect on the county was visible from any crossroads: fewer mailboxes on the gravel roads, fewer trucks at the co-op, fewer children at the county school, fewer lights in the farmhouse windows at night. Of the 23 farmers who had purchased rebuilt equipment from Robert Williams between 1983 and 1988, all 23 were still farming in 1991. Everyone. Not one had lost their land. Not one had been foreclosed. Not one had surrendered equipment to a bank or missed a lease payment or filed for the kind of restructuring that was a polite word for surrender. 23 for 23. The machines Robert had sold them were still running. The debt those machines had allowed them to avoid was the debt that had destroyed everyone else. That was the math that Mike Johnson was carrying with him when he sat down on the bench outside the Waverly feed store on a Thursday morning in September of 1991, and found Robert Williams already sitting there. Robert had stopped to pick up mineral supplement for his cattle. Mike had come to town for reasons he did not volunteer. They had not spoken to each other since the morning of the lot liquidation in October of '86. 5 years. They had seen each other. You cannot avoid seeing a man in a town the size of Waverly, but they had not spoken, because speaking required one of them to begin, and beginning required one of them to acknowledge something that the silence had been holding in place. Robert was sitting on the left side of the bench. Mike sat down on the right side. The distance between them was about 3 feet of wooden slats and 8 years of a disagreement that had never been stated as a disagreement, because Robert had never argued, and Mike had never stopped being certain long enough to notice that no one was arguing back. They sat for what witnesses later estimated was 2 full minutes without either man saying a word. A pickup truck passed on the street. A dog barked somewhere behind the grain elevator. The feed store door opened and closed twice while they sat there, and both times the person coming out glanced at the 2 men on the bench and kept walking. Because the body language of those 2 figures sitting 3 feet apart with their eyes forward and their mouths closed was not the body language of men who wanted company. Mike spoke first. His voice was different from the voice Robert remembered from the Waverly Cafe in '83. That voice had been certain, patronizing, pitched to carry. This voice was quieter, flatter. The voice of a man who had been rehearsing something for a long time and had not found a way to make it sound the way he wanted it to sound, and had finally given up trying, and was just going to say it the way it came out. I spent 22 years telling farmers they needed new equipment. Every farmer who walked into my dealership, I told them the same thing. Trade up, finance the upgrade, get the new model. I wrote $2.1 million in equipment loans through that dealership over 22 years. Mike stopped, looked at his hands in his lap. You know how many of those farmers are still on their land? Robert did not answer. He did not turn his head. He waited. Mike's hands were in his lap. He was looking at them the way people look at their hands when they are trying to find a place to put an emotion that does not fit anywhere comfortable. 11 out of maybe 60. The word 11 sat in the September air between them. It was a small word for the size of the thing it was carrying. Mike was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question that Robert understood was not really a question. It was a confession shaped like a question, because Mike Johnson had spent his life giving answers and did not know how to give a confession directly. How many of your customers are still farming? Robert looked at Mike for the first time since Mike had sat down. The man beside him was 55 years old. His hair had gone gray in the 5 years since the dealership closed. His clothes were clean, but they were not new. And his hands, which had always been the soft hands of a man who sold equipment rather than fixed it, had developed the particular roughness of someone who had been doing manual work. Robert had heard through the feed store network that Mike had taken a job managing a small engine repair shop in Cedar Falls. Not selling, repairing. All of them. Robert's voice was quiet. Every single one. Mike nodded. He did not seem surprised. He seemed like a man who had already known the answer and had needed to hear it spoken aloud by the person who had the right to say it, the way a man sometimes needs to hear a doctor confirm what the symptoms have already told him. The silence returned. It was not the same silence as before. The first silence had been the silence of 2 men who had not yet begun. This silence was the silence of 2 men in the middle of something, and the middle required one of them to say the thing that the arithmetic had been pointing toward for 8 years. Robert said it, not loudly, not with anger or satisfaction or vindication, with the tone of voice that his father had used when explaining something to Robert in the shop. The teacher voice, the voice that presents a fact and lets the fact do the work. The equipment was never the problem, Mike. The debt was. 9 words. Mike Johnson heard them, and his jaw tightened, and his eyes closed briefly. The way a man's eyes close when something truer than what he has been telling himself arrives at a spot that has been tender for a long time. He did not argue. He did not qualify. He did not offer context or explanation or the kind of defensive accounting that men in his position usually offer when confronted with the consequences of advice they gave in good faith. He stood up. He extended his hand. Robert shook it. The handshake lasted exactly long enough and not a second longer. Then Mike Johnson walked to his truck and drove away. And Robert Williams sat on the bench for another few minutes, watching the street and the grain elevator and all the ordinary details of a Thursday morning in Waverly, Iowa. And then he went inside and bought his mineral supplement and drove home. Because the 32 tractors had one more thing to teach Bremer County. Robert continued farming his 180 acres through the 1990s with the same methods his father had used, and his father before that. Tight rotation, equipment maintained in the shop, no debt. The Farmall M he had kept for himself accumulated hours and seasons, and the kind of patina that machines develop when they are used every day by someone who takes care of them. The red paint faded slightly along the hood where the sun hit it hardest. The seat developed a permanent impression that matched Robert's posture exactly. The steering wheel wore smooth at the positions where his hands always rested. 10 and 2, the way Thomas had taught him. By 1995, every machine Robert had sold was still in service somewhere in northeast Iowa. Christopher Martinez's Farmall M. The first one Robert had rebuilt. The $119 restoration that he sold for $1,100 in May of '83 was plowing Christopher's fields 12 years later without a major repair. Christopher had expanded to 340 acres by then. All of it leased. All of it worked with equipment he owned outright. He had never carried an equipment loan. He had never missed a lease payment. He was 36 years old, and he was one of the most successful young farmers in Bremer County. And the foundation of everything he had built was a 40-year-old tractor that a dealership owner had called scrap metal. Brandon Walker, who had bought the Alice Chalmers WD-45 for $1,300 in '84, had renegotiated his lease into a purchase agreement in '90, and owned the 200 acres his father had lost to foreclosure 6 years earlier. He was elected president of the Bremer County Farm Bureau in '94. His acceptance speech was 4 sentences long, and one of those sentences was about Robert Williams, though he did not use Robert's name. Somebody told me once that fixing old equipment was a waste of time. The people who told me that are gone. The equipment is still running. Draw your own conclusions. Ryan Robinson, the youngest of the 3 men who had received machines at the lot delivery in October of '86, paid off his land contract in '95. 80 acres free and clear. He told the clerk at the county recorder's office that the first piece of equipment he had ever owned was a Ford 8N, that a man in Waverly had sold him for $600, and that the Ford was still parked in his barn, and that he intended to keep it there for as long as the barn was standing. Kenneth Anderson did not live to see most of this. Kenneth died in November of 1993 at the age of 88. His funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Waverly on a gray November afternoon, and the church was full in the way that churches are full when the person being remembered was known by everyone and owed favors by most of them. Robert sat in the third pew with Linda and David. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to speak, Robert stood up, which surprised several people in the room, because Robert Williams was not a man who stood up in public to say things. He spoke for less than a minute. He said that Kenneth Anderson had driven out to his farm on a spring afternoon in '83 to look at 32 broken machines that nobody else thought were worth looking at. He said that Kenneth had walked the rows for 40 minutes and had identified 9 machines that could be saved. He said that Kenneth had spent Saturday afternoons in Robert's shop for 2 years, teaching him things about engines that his father had not lived long enough to teach him. And he said that Kenneth had told him something the first day they met that Robert had thought about every day since. Most folks see rust. You and I, we see what's underneath. That's not just about tractors. Robert paused. He looked at the coffin at the front of the church. Kenneth taught me that rust is just time's way of asking if you're paying attention. He sat down. Linda put her hand on his knee. David, who was 31 years old by then and had been working beside his father on the farm for 6 years, looked at his father's face and saw something there that he would remember for the rest of his life. The community impact of Robert's 32 tractors did not become fully visible until the late 1990s, when the agricultural economists at Iowa State University began publishing county-level data on the farm survival rates during and after the crisis years. The numbers told a story that the people of Bremer County already knew but had never seen quantified. In counties where farm consolidation had been heaviest, where institutional buyers had acquired the most distressed acreage during the '80s. Farm survival rates for operations under 300 acres ran between 31 and 38%. In Bremer County, the survival rate for the same category was 54%. The difference was not entirely attributable to Robert Williams's rebuilt tractors. Bremer County had other advantages: good soil, a relatively diversified local economy, a cooperative culture that resisted consolidation more strongly than some neighboring counties. But the 23 farms that Robert had equipped were still there, and those 23 farms collectively worked over 14,000 acres by 1999. and their survival had held together a network of feed stores and co-ops and equipment repair shops and school districts and church congregations that would have thinned or disappeared if those 23 families had gone the way of the other 49. In the spring of 1998, a delivery truck arrived at Robert's farm. The driver carried a wooden crate to the shop door. Robert opened it on the workbench. Inside, packed in newspaper and shop rags, was a complete set of snap-on hand tools. Wrenches, sockets, ratchets, screwdrivers, pliers, the full professional line, used but well maintained, each one wiped clean and organized in the case with the care of someone who understood that tools deserve the same respect as the machines they service. There was a note in the crate. It was written on a piece of lined notebook paper, and the handwriting was less steady than it had once been. The note said, "These should be somewhere they're still used." It was unsigned, but Robert recognized the snap-on set. He had seen it on the service bench at Johnson Farm and implement every time he had walked through those service bay doors over 22 years. They were Mike Johnson's personal tools, the ones he had kept when everything else was auctioned, the ones he had carried with him from the dealership to the small engine shop in Cedar Falls, and then, when the small engine shop closed in '96, to his garage at home, where they had sat on a bench that was no longer being used by a man who was no longer sure what he was supposed to be doing with his hands. Robert set the tools on the workbench, beside his father's tools. Thomas's wrenches collected over 40 years from farm sales and flea markets and the slow, patient accumulation of a working life. Mike's snap-on set, the professional-grade equipment of a man who had sold machines for a living and had finally understood 15 years too late that the man who fixed them had been right all along. Two sets of tools on the same bench. Two different philosophies of what equipment was for. Robert stood in the shop and looked at them, and understood that this was the closest Mike Johnson would ever come to saying what the bench conversation in '91 had not quite finished saying. The tools were the last word. David Williams had come home to Bremer County in '87 after 3 years working for an agricultural equipment company in Waterloo. He had learned things in Waterloo that his father did not know. Computer diagnostics, electronic fuel injection, the digital systems that were beginning to appear in the newest generation of farm equipment. But he had also learned something else in Waterloo, which was that knowing how a computer diagnoses a problem is not the same as knowing how to fix the problem, and that the gap between those two kinds of knowledge was widening every year as equipment became more complex and less repairable by the people who used it. David came home because he wanted to farm, but he also came home because he had watched his father rebuild 28 machines with hand tools and patience, and he understood that what his father was preserving was not just old equipment, but a kind of knowledge that was disappearing from American agriculture, the way topsoil disappears from a field that is not managed carefully, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look up and realize that something essential is gone and you cannot get it back. In 2001, David opened a community workshop in his grandfather's shop. He did not charge admission. He did not charge tuition. He posted a notice at the feed store and the co-op and the cafe in Waverly that said simply, "If you want to learn how to fix your own equipment, come to the Williams shop on Saturday mornings. Bring your tools if you have them. If you don't, we have enough." The first Saturday, 4 young farmers showed up. By the third Saturday, there were 9. By the end of the first month, David was running 2 sessions, morning and afternoon, and the parking area beside the shop held more trucks on Saturdays than it held on any other day of the week. David taught them the way his father had taught him, which was the way his grandfather had taught his father, which was the way Kenneth Anderson had taught half the county for 36 years before that. Hands on the machine. Listen to the engine. Fuel, spark, compression. Check them in that order. Don't skip a step. On the wall above the workbench, David had hung 2 things. His grandfather Thomas's repair notebook opened to the page with the sentence that Robert had found in '83. "Don't count what you've spent. Count what you saved someone else from spending." And beside it a framed inventory list in Linda's handwriting. 32 machines, 28 rebuilt, 23 sold, 23 families still on their land. The tools on the workbench were a combination that no catalog had ever assembled. Thomas Williams's hand-collected wrenches and socket sets acquired over 3 decades. Mike Johnson's professional snap-on set delivered without a signature in the spring of '98, and the basic starter kits that David had purchased for workshop participants who arrived with nothing but willingness. Joshua Martinez showed up on the 4th Saturday. He was 19 years old. He drove the same Farmall M that his father had purchased from Robert Williams in May of '83 for $1,100. The machine was 18 years into a second life. The engine started on the first crank. The paint had faded again, but the castings were sound and the transmission was tight, and the hydraulics worked the way they had worked when they left the factory in '47, which was the way they had worked when Robert rebuilt them in his father's shop in the spring of '83, which was the way they were still working on a Saturday morning in 2001 when a 19-year-old boy drove the machine into the same yard where his father had first seen it, and asked David Williams to teach him how to adjust the valve lash. David showed him. He used his grandfather's technique. Close your eyes, listen. The engine will tell you what it needs. On the morning of March 9, 2004, Robert Williams was 72 years old. He had farmed his 180 acres for 43 years. He had never borrowed a dollar against the land or the equipment or the shop or the house. He had rebuilt 28 machines from a lot of 32 that he purchased for $8,700 at an auction where everyone laughed. He had sold 23 of them to farmers who could not have stayed on their land without them. He had kept one for himself, the first Farmall M, and he had driven it every working day for 21 years. On the morning of March 9th, Robert went to the shop early. Linda was still in the kitchen. The March air was cold in the way that Iowa air is cold at the end of winter, not the biting cold of January, but the damp waiting cold of a season that is almost finished but not quite. Robert started the Farmall the way he started it every morning. Choke out, throttle set, key turned, and the engine caught on the second crank and settled into the idle that Robert knew, the way he knew his own heartbeat. He left it running to warm up. He went inside the shop. The wood stove was cold. He lit it the way his father had lit it. Newspaper and kindling and 2 splits of oak. And he waited for the cast iron to begin radiating warmth the way cast iron does. Slowly, steadily, the way everything in that shop had always worked. He stood at the workbench. His father's tools were in their places. Mike's snap-on set was in its case beside them. The repair notebook was open on the bench where David had left it after Saturday's workshop. On the wall, Linda's inventory list hung in its frame. 247 entries in green ink on cream-colored paper. His father's voice came one last time, not as a memory triggered by a sound or a sensation, just as a presence. The quiet accumulation of 40 years of conversations in this room, soaked into the concrete floor and the wooden beams and the workbench surface that had been worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. The best inheritance isn't land, Robert. It's knowing how to take care of what you've got. Robert sat down on the shop stool. The wood stove was ticking as the iron expanded. The Farmall M was idling outside, its exhaust note steady in the March air. He closed his eyes. Linda found him at 7:30. She had come to tell him breakfast was ready. The shop was warm. The wood stove was burning evenly. The Farmall M was still running outside, its engine turning over with the unhurried patience of a machine that did not know its owner was gone, and would have kept running all day if no one had turned the key. Linda stood in the shop door for a long time. She looked at Robert on the stool, and she looked at the tools on the bench, and she looked at the notebook and the inventory list and the walls of the building that Thomas Williams had built in '58, and then she walked outside and turned off the Farmall M. The engine stopped. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of the echo of every engine that had ever been started and every machine that had ever been fixed, and every conversation that had ever been held in that shop between people who understood that the things worth doing are the things you do with your hands and your patience and your willingness to listen. Robert Williams's funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Waverly on a Saturday afternoon. The church was full. Christopher Martinez was there, 45 years old now, farming 340 acres, every piece of equipment owned outright. Brandon Walker was there. president of the County Farm Bureau, the 200 acres his father had lost now back in his name. Ryan Robinson was there, 40 years old, 80 acres paid off, the Ford 8N still in his barn. 17 other farmers who had bought machines from Robert were there, spread across the pews, some with their sons and daughters, some with grandchildren who had never met the man being buried, but who were farming land that would not have been in the family without him. Carol Anderson, Kenneth's daughter, had driven from Dubuque. She sat in the back row and did not speak to anyone, but she stayed for the entire service. Mike Johnson was there, 68 years old. He sat in the last pew on the left side, alone, wearing a clean shirt and a jacket that was 10 years old and a tie that he had clearly not worn in a long time. He did not speak during the service. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share a memory, Mike looked at his hands for a long moment and then shook his head very slightly. The way a man shakes his head when the thing he wants to say is too large for the room he is sitting in and the occasion he is sitting in it for. He stayed for the reception afterward. He shook David's hand and held it for a long time, and said 4 words. He was right, David. Then he left. Linda lived in the farmhouse until 2011. David farmed the 180 acres and ran the community workshop from Thomas's shop every Saturday morning. The workbench held 3 generations of tools. The wall held the repair notebook and the inventory list. The parking area held the trucks of young farmers who came to learn what Robert and Thomas and Kenneth had known, that a machine is not a product to be consumed and replaced, but a relationship to be maintained and understood, and that the man who maintains and understands his own equipment is a man who cannot be leveraged out of his livelihood by anyone selling anything. Joshua Martinez, 23 years old now, was teaching in the workshop alongside David. The same Farmall M his grandfather had bought in '83 was still running, 25 years into its second life. It would pass to his children. Today, a new John Deere 8R Series tractor costs $350,000. Monthly payment over $4,200 for 7 years. Total finance cost approximately $352,800 with current rates. A young farmer starting out in Bremer County, or any county in Iowa or Nebraska or Kansas or Minnesota, faces the same choice that Robert Williams's neighbors faced in '83. Finance the new machine and carry the debt and hope that commodity prices and interest rates and weather cooperate for the full term of the loan, or find another way. Manufacturers today use software locks to prevent farmers from repairing their own equipment, diagnostic codes that can only be read by dealer technicians, firmware updates that disable aftermarket parts, end-user license agreements that define the farmer not as the owner of the machine, but as a licensee of the software that runs it. In Robert Williams's time, the lock was financial. Today, it is digital. The principle is the same. Dependency is profitable for the people selling it. Independence is not. The shop Thomas Williams built in 1958 is still standing. The concrete floor has a permanent oil stain near the center where the Farmall M sat the night Robert first pulled it inside and stood beside it without touching anything. David runs the community workshop from it every Saturday. The snap-on wrenches Mike Johnson sent in the spring of '98 hang on the pegboard beside the hand tools Thomas collected over 40 years. Young farmers sit on the same stools and lean over the same bench and learn the same lesson that has been taught in that room since '58, which is that a machine will tell you what it needs if you are willing to close your eyes and listen. On the wall above the workbench in Robert's handwriting on a piece of notebook paper that is beginning to yellow at the edges is a single sentence. Every broken machine is just a conversation you haven't finished yet. His father wrote it first. Robert found it. David framed it. And on Saturday mornings in Waverly, Iowa, in a shop that smells like diesel and old iron and the faint sweetness of oak smoke from a wood stove that has been warming the same room for more than 60 years, the conversation continues. The lesson is not complicated. A $119 rebuild kept a family on their land. A $32,000 loan took one off it. Maintenance costs less than payments. Knowledge weighs less than debt. An old machine you understand is worth more than a new machine that owns you. Don't laugh at what you don't understand. Don't bet against a quiet man with his father's tools. And don't ever confuse the price of something with what it's worth.